In the darkest corners of medieval history, torture wasn't always about chains, knives, or fire. Some of the most horrifying punishments left no wounds at all, because they attacked something far more fragile, the human mind. Hidden chambers, shifting shadows, silent rooms, and subtle illusions were used to break prisoners slowly, quietly, and completely. These were torments so rare and so disturbing that they barely survived in old records, yet they reveal a chilling truth: the scariest torture is the one your own senses create. Tonight, we're opening the door to those forgotten horrors. Stay close.
Even deeper into medieval darkness existed punishments so quiet, so subtle, and so painfully clever that they were almost never written down. These weren't devices but environmental traps, rooms designed to slowly warp a prisoner's senses until their own mind became the instrument of torture. Some prisoners were kept in cells where the floor was covered in very shallow grooves, barely half a finger deep. When they walked, the grooves directed tiny currents of air between their toes, making it feel like insects ran along their skin. Others were forced into rooms with stones arranged in an uneven grid, one tile depressed slightly when stepped on, another lifted. The pattern was random, so every step felt unstable. After hours, the prisoner's legs trembled uncontrollably as the body constantly overcorrected. Another eerie method involved suspending a dried gourd filled with 2 small seeds from the ceiling. Even the prisoner's faint breathing made the seeds roll inside with soft tapping sounds. In darkness, that faint noise felt like someone pacing slowly. In colder dungeons, a thin slit high on the wall allowed narrow drafts to sweep downward unpredictably. The cold air brushed their neck or ear, making prisoners believe someone stood right behind them. Some cells had ceilings coated with limestone that naturally absorbed moisture at different rates. Drops formed slowly, but instead of falling, they clung to the ceiling and shook with every vibration. Prisoners stared upward in fear, believing something alive moved above them. In certain monastic cells, a bowl of smooth stones was placed near the wall. Temperature shifts caused the stones to crack softly, producing popping sounds like quiet footsteps. One psychological torment placed a nearly invisible horsehair across the entrance of the cell. Every time the prisoner crossed the doorway, the hair brushed their cheek without them understanding the source. Some believed it was a cobweb, others believed it was a hand.
Some medieval punishments were so subtle and so psychologically corrosive that they were barely torture in the traditional sense. They were slow mental unravelings, engineered through tiny sensory tricks that wore down perception, balance, time awareness, and the prisoner's connection to reality. One forgotten torment placed prisoners in a room where the floor stones were arranged in an outward spiral pattern. The spiral didn't move, but staring at it for hours under flickering torchlight made it seem like it was rotating. Many prisoners became dizzy, nauseous, or convinced the room itself was turning. Another chilling method involved a small hollow reed embedded inside the wall. Whenever wind passed outside, the reed produced faint, breath-like sounds. The prisoner never saw the source and often believed someone was whispering from inside the stone. Some dungeons used a cell with a single stone that warmed slightly faster than the others. The warmth came and went slowly, making prisoners think someone was touching the wall behind them with a warm hand. Another rare torment placed a pebble beneath the victim's clothing, not sharp, just irritating. As the prisoner shifted, the pebble's random movement created a constant maddening pressure that seemed to crawl across the body. In some monastic cells, straw was scattered unevenly so the faint rustling with each step echoed as if someone else moved too. Another bizarre punishment involved a rope suspended from the ceiling, dangling with a few beads tied near the bottom. The beads never touched the prisoner, but the slightest air movement made them sway. The moving beads created the sense of an invisible presence pacing the cell. A particularly haunting method involved a shallow groove carved into the wall in a wave pattern. When light passed across it, the groove created the illusion of shifting shadows. Victims thought figures were lurking just out of sight. Some prisoners were placed in a cell. Medieval torment went so deep into psychological territory that some punishments barely left physical marks at all. They dismantled sanity slowly, using light, shadows, echo, breath, temperature, subtle imbalance, and the mind's own fear. Here are more extremely rare, almost never recorded medieval tortures, even stranger and more disturbing than everything before. Some prisoners were placed in a cell where the walls were coated with a thin layer of uneven plaster. When torches flickered outside, the bumps created crawling shadows that looked like dozens of tiny creatures moving. Victims often swore insects filled the walls, though none existed. Another torment involved a hanging reed tube that captured the faintest drafts. The tube produced soft whistling sounds that mimicked distant singing or crying. Hearing human-like sounds without a source broke many prisoners' mental stability. In some dungeons, prisoners were forced to sit with their back against a slightly warmed stone panel. The warmth wasn't enough to comfort, it felt like a human hand pressing against them from behind. The sensation vanished and returned unpredictably as the stone absorbed and released heat, creating dread of someone standing right behind them in the darkness. Others endured the sway-track floor, where the wood planks beneath them were installed just loose enough to shift a millimeter. Every movement caused a soft tilt that the mind interpreted as the room inhaling. A terrifying psychological method used a small wooden disc placed on the ground. The prisoner was told not to step on it. Nothing would happen if they did, but they didn't know that. The stress of avoiding the disc created constant paranoia, trembling, and obsessive fixation. Another torture involved forcing prisoners to place their head against a wall where faint tapping came from the other side, created by a guard with a padded stick. The tapping varied so slightly that the prisoner believed someone was communicating. Medieval cruelty reached such bizarre depths that some punishments barely even qualified as physical torture. They were slow psychological dissolutions, crafted to torment a prisoner using light, sound, balance, temperature, breath, and the slightest distortions of reality. Here are more extremely rare medieval tortures, even more obscure and eerie than before. Prisoners were sometimes put in a chamber where the ceiling was carved with shallow grooves in spirals. When a torch flickered beneath them, those grooves created the illusion that the ceiling was slowly rotating. Hours of staring upward made victims nauseous, dizzy, and terrified that the ceiling might collapse. In another chamber, the walls were built slightly concave, so subtly it wasn't visible, but standing near them made echoes sound warped and wrong. Victims sometimes believed voices whispered from inside the stone. Some punishments used a single feather suspended from the ceiling at forehead level. Prisoners constantly expected it to touch them, though it rarely did. Even one accidental brush created panic because the mind filled in sensations of crawling or contact that never happened. Another torment involved shallow water channels running under the floor. When winds blew outside, the water gurgled unpredictably, echoing like distant footsteps or breathing. In isolated monasteries, offenders sat before a wall with tiny indentations arranged in confusing patterns. Under dim light, these dots seemed to move or shimmer, tricking the brain into thinking insects crawled behind the stone. Another silent torture placed the prisoner on a wooden board that flexed slightly with every inhale. Their own breathing caused tiny movements that felt unnatural, as if the floor breathed with them. Some dungeons had temperature ghosts, areas where the stone absorbed warmth unevenly. One shoulder felt warm while the other felt cold, creating the unnerving sense that someone stood beside them, exhaling or withdrawing. Some medieval punishments were so subtle, so strange, and so mentally invasive that they were almost never written about, tools and rooms built not to injure bodies, but to quietly dismantle a person's sense of reality. One such torment used a cell whose walls were coated with uneven mineral crystals. Whenever torchlight flickered, tiny sparkles glinted unpredictably. Prisoners thought insects, eyes, or reflections were appearing on the walls, and many panicked at shadows that weren't there. In another punishment, a small hollow gourd filled with a few seeds was hung from the ceiling. Any movement, even breathing, made the seeds shift inside with a soft pattering noise. Victims believed someone whispered above them or crept along the ceiling. Some dungeons placed prisoners on slightly soft earth floors that sank under their weight by just a few millimeters. This subtle sinking sensation made them feel like they were gradually being pulled underground. Another eerie method involved a single strand of thread stretched across the cell at chest height. It didn't restrain them, it simply brushed the skin lightly whenever they moved. The constant faint contact created an uncontrollable feeling of phantom crawling. Some prisoners endured the hidden glint trap, where a tiny polished stone was embedded in a dark wall. In low light, it caught and reflected just enough glow to make it appear like a watchful eye. Prisoners stared at it in fear until exhaustion blurred their vision. Monastic prisons sometimes used a silent bowl of water placed behind the prisoner, not in front. The faint ripples echoed oddly, creating the sensation of someone walking softly behind them even in complete isolation. In some castles, prisoners sat on a slab with a tiny tilt so slight they couldn't identify the angle. The feeling that the ground was sliding became a constant, gnawing discomfort. Others faced a cell where the ceiling dripped water at inconsistent intervals, sometimes 5 seconds. Medieval cruelty went even deeper into strange, quiet, mind-breaking punishments that almost no one knows about. One of the rarest was a chamber where the floor tilted just slightly, too little to fall, but enough that the prisoner constantly felt as if they were sliding. Hours of this subtle imbalance exhausted the legs and twisted the spine until pain spread slowly upward. Another punishment used a tiny hanging bead placed near the prisoner's eyelashes. Every blink made the bead shift slightly, creating a constant irritation that slowly drove victims toward madness. In some dungeons, prisoners were forced to stand near a wall with faint tapping sounds coming from inside the stone, produced by hollow wooden tubes that carried echoes. The tapping never had a rhythm, and the unpredictable noise made victims jump with every sound. Some cells had shifting airflow vents so small that most prisoners never saw them. Warm air and cold air blew in random intervals, confusing the body's senses until the victim could no longer tell whether it was day or night. A particularly chilling torture involved a weighted thread tied lightly around a single finger. The weight was tiny, barely noticeable, but after hours the constant downward pull caused throbbing nerve pain that crawled up into the arm. Another method forced prisoners to stand in a room where faint engraving lines were drawn on the floor in crooked, uneven shapes. The eyes naturally tried to follow them, but the distorted patterns created dizziness and nausea, making the victim feel as if the ground were subtly twisting. Some prisons used a flicker window slit, just wide enough for a thin blade of light to slide across the cell wall whenever someone walked past outside. The light appeared unpredictably, making prisoners certain a figure was approaching each time. Others faced the near-touch punishment, where pieces of soft straw hung from the ceiling, brushing the skin lightly whenever the prisoner shifted. Medieval cruelty went even deeper into strange, quiet, mind-breaking punishments that almost no one knows about. One of the rarest was a chamber where the floor tilted just slightly, too little to fall, but enough that the prisoner constantly felt as if they were sliding. Hours of this subtle imbalance exhausted the legs and twisted the spine until pain spread slowly upward. Another punishment used a tiny hanging bead placed near the prisoner's eyelashes. Every blink made the bead shift slightly, creating a constant irritation that slowly drove victims toward madness. In some dungeons, prisoners were forced to stand near a wall with faint tapping sounds coming from inside the stone, produced by hollow wooden tubes that carried echoes. The tapping never had a rhythm, and the unpredictable noise made victims jump with every sound. Some cells had shifting airflow vents so small that most prisoners never saw them. Warm air and cold air blew in random intervals, confusing the body's senses until the victim could no longer tell whether it was day or night. A particularly chilling torture involved a weighted thread tied lightly around a single finger. The weight was tiny, barely noticeable, but after hours the constant downward pull caused throbbing nerve pain that crawled up into the arm. Another method forced prisoners to stand in a room where faint engraving lines were drawn on the floor in crooked, uneven shapes. The eyes naturally tried to follow them, but the distorted patterns created dizziness and nausea, making the victim feel as if the ground were subtly twisting. Some prisons used a flicker window slit, just wide enough for a thin blade of light to slide across the cell wall whenever someone walked past outside. The light appeared unpredictably, making prisoners certain a figure was approaching each time. Others faced the near-touch punishment, where pieces of soft straw hung from the ceiling, brushing the skin lightly whenever the prisoner shifted. It didn't hurt. Even after exploring so many brutal medieval punishments, history still contains stranger, more obscure torment methods, ones that were rarely recorded because they were used only in isolated fortresses, secret courts, or by rulers who wanted absolute psychological control. These were not always bloody, but they were terrifying in how cleverly they attacked the mind and body. One of the rarest punishments was the weight shift rack. Victims were forced to stand on two uneven blocks, one slightly higher than the other. Every few minutes, the blocks were swapped. The constant shifting forced the prisoner to balance in unnatural ways until muscles trembled uncontrollably. Hours of this left the body locked in spasms without causing major injuries, perfect for interrogators who wanted long-term suffering. Another eerie method was the mist chamber. Prisoners stood in a cold room where fine mist sprayed constantly. Not enough to soak them, but enough to chill the skin and make the body shiver endlessly. Days of mild dampness caused exhaustion, sleeplessness, aching bones, and creeping dread. The victim felt like they were freezing even though no frostbite ever formed. Some medieval regions used the whisper grate. A metal screen was placed inches before the prisoner's face. Guards stood out of sight and whispered indistinct phrases through it, never loud enough to understand, but always just audible enough to trigger paranoia. After long exposure, prisoners began imagining voices, orders, footsteps, or accusations. There was also the stagger belt, a thick strap tied around the waist with weights pulling in different directions. Prisoners were forced to walk in a straight line while the belt tugged them unpredictably. The struggle wasn't about pain, it was about humiliation and loss of control. Falling meant starting over. One rare psychological punishment was the reflection cell. The walls were coated with faintly reflective metal, not polished like mirrors. Even after the endless horrors we've explored, the medieval world still hides more punishments, deeply obscure, rarely used, and often so psychologically destructive that even historians struggle to believe they were real. These were the kinds of torments used only in secret courts, underground dungeons, or by warlords who wanted to break the human spirit without leaving obvious wounds. One of the strangest was the breathing cage, a metal frame locked around the chest. It didn't crush the ribs, it restricted them. Victims could breathe, but only shallowly, like sucking air through a pinhole. Hours of this left them dizzy, panicked, and gasping endlessly, trapped between suffocating and surviving. Another little-known method was the knee-splitter beam. Victims knelt on a wooden plank lined with iron ridges while weights were added to their shoulders. The pressure forced the knees deeper into the metal until the cartilage and ligaments screamed in agony. There was also the blindfold circle walk. Prisoners were blindfolded and forced to walk in tight circles inside a narrow room. The floor was uneven, sometimes soft, sometimes hard, sometimes slightly sloped. After hours, disorientation set in so intensely that victims couldn't tell whether they were moving forward, spinning, falling, or dreaming. In remote castles, offenders faced the echo corridor punishment. A long hallway made of curved stone amplified every noise the victim made, breathing, swallowing, footsteps, so loudly that it sounded like dozens of people were following them. Some screamed just to drown out their own amplified heartbeat. Another horrifying but little-known tool was the cold pinch fork. Two parallel metal rods were placed on the victim's arms or legs, cooled with ice or snow. The freezing contact numbed the skin, then burned it, then caused deep, throbbing pain as the flesh stiffened. When removed, blood rushed back so painfully that victims fainted instantly. Just when it seems medieval cruelty has reached its final limit, even darker and almost unbelievable punishments emerge from hidden chronicles, methods so extreme they were used only in secret dungeons, war camps, or remote feudal estates. One such chilling invention was the vertebrae vice. Victims were forced to lie on their stomach while a long metal rod with adjustable clamps pressed against the spine. With each turn of the screw, a single vertebra was forced downward or sideways, creating sharp jolts of pain through the entire nervous system. The torture didn't break the back instantly, it twisted it slowly, leaving the victim screaming with every breath. Another horrifying device was the ear gouge mask, a helmet fitted with sharp prongs aimed at the ears. If the victim moved, even slightly, the prongs ripped deeper. Some were left wearing it for days, making sleeping or even nodding impossible without tearing flesh. In certain regions, prisoners faced the embers crawl, where they were chained on all fours over cooled ashes mixed with glowing embers. Their hands and knees burned blister by blister as guards forced them to crawl forward. If they stopped, more embers were raked beneath them. Another ghastly method was the throat funnel torture. A horn-shaped funnel was pressed into the mouth, and cold or hot liquids, water, oil, brine, or even sour wine, were poured in until the stomach swelled painfully. Guards then pressed on the abdomen to force vomiting, only to repeat the process over and over in a cycle of choking and retching. There was also the resin coffin, a wooden sarcophagus coated inside with sticky resin and sand. Prisoners were locked inside and left in the heat so the resin softened and glued their skin to the wood. Any attempt to move tore the skin off in sheets. More rare still was the pulse striker, a torture where thin wooden sticks were tapped rhythmically on nerves near the wrists or ankles. The constant tapping created electric-like jolts. Even when it feels like we've reached the deepest, darkest corners of medieval cruelty, history still has more monstrous punishments hidden in its shadows. One of the rarest but most horrifying devices was the jaw yoke vice. This metal frame locked around the head with two plates, one beneath the chin, the other above the skull. A screw tightened slowly, crushing the jaw upward into the teeth while pressing the top plate downward. Victims felt their jawbone grind, their teeth shatter, and their skull vibrate with unbearable pressure long before they fainted. Another forgotten torment was the ankle splitter, shaped like a wedge lined with spikes. Executioners placed it between the ankles and hammered until bones splintered outward, leaving victims permanently crippled but horrifyingly conscious. In certain mountain regions, criminals faced the frost coffin. A wooden box with dozens of small holes was placed outdoors in snow. Victims were locked inside wearing only a thin cloth. As icy winds filled the box, their breath condensed into frost, slowly freezing their eyelashes, lips, and fingers. Hours felt like eternal winter as hypothermia crept in, but the coffin design kept them alive just long enough to prolong the torture. Some villages used the crawling wheel, a large rotating drum with sharp ridges inside. Victims were forced to crawl within it, each movement scraping their skin raw. Guards spun the drum randomly, slamming the victim against the ridged walls until bruises, cuts, and broken ribs left them breathless. In coastal towns, there existed the salt iron lash. Wounds made by whips were immediately rubbed with salt water or packed with coarse salt crystals. Infection set in quickly, turning minutes of pain into days of agony. Even stranger was the hollow stone mask. Shaped like a human face but much heavier, it was strapped onto prisoners' heads. Inside, the rough stone ground against their skin with every movement, scraping their cheeks and forehead. Even when it feels like medieval punishments couldn't possibly get more horrifying, history continues to reveal darker, rarer, and almost unbelievable methods that were used in hidden chambers, remote villages, or by secret inquisitorial groups. One such nightmare was the throat spike collar, a metal band fitted with a single long spike pointing inward. Once locked around the neck, the victim had to hold their head perfectly still. Any attempt to swallow, cough, or lower the chin drove the spike into their throat, turning even breathing into a torture. Another terrifying device was the iron bow, a curved metal bar pressed across the victim's back and shins while they were bent forward. Tightened gradually, it crushed the spine inward and squeezed the lungs until the victim gasped violently for air. In deeply secluded regions, guards used the crawling pit, a narrow, tunnel-like cage where the victim could move only on hands and knees. The floor was covered with broken pottery, stones, or old metal scraps, shredding their palms and knees with every inch forward. Sometimes the only food was placed at the far end, forcing days of bloody crawling in pitch darkness. Another rare punishment was the friction rope. Rough ropes were tied tightly around arms or thighs, and guards pulled steadily until the rope burned through flesh, slowly sawing deeper with every tug. More sinister still was the heat box, a small iron chamber where a victim's head was locked inside while a fire or hot stones were placed below. The air heated gradually, roasting the skin and suffocating the prisoner in burning smoke. Some chambers had small holes for spectators to listen to the screams inside. In other areas, criminals faced the pointed grave, a vertical coffin dug into the ground with a sharpened stake at the bottom. The victim was lowered slowly, too slowly to kill instantly, until the stake pierced them, the weight of their own body making the impalement sure but agonizingly slow. Just when it seems medieval punishments cannot get any darker, even more chilling and lesser-known methods emerge, devices so cruel they were often banned, hidden, or used only by secret inquisitorial chambers. One such horror was the jaw splitter. This brutal device was inserted into the mouth and cranked open until the jawbone cracked apart, tearing muscles and dislocating joints. Victims were often left alive afterward, permanently disfigured and unable to speak, eat, or scream again. Another terrifying instrument was the rib spreader, a claw-like tool that was thrust beneath the ribs and opened slowly, lifting the ribcage apart while the victim stayed fully conscious. Each breath became a knife of pain stabbing through their lungs and spine. Some regions used the spine bender, a curved bench that forced victims backward until their spine nearly snapped. Executioners would press slowly on the chest or legs, creating a bending motion that dislocated vertebrae one by one. Many prisoners died not from the breaking, but from the shock and paralysis that followed. Another gruesome torture was the ash suffocation box, where victims were placed inside wooden coffins filled with fine ash. Every breath pulled tiny particles into their lungs, causing burning, choking, and slow suffocation. In some cases, the ash was mixed with crushed glass to increase the torment. There was also the horrifying needle cloak, a garment made from leather lined inside with hundreds of tiny iron needles. Once strapped on, every movement, breathing, twitching, shivering, drove the needles deeper into the skin. Prisoners were forced to walk in crowds wearing this cloak, turning each step into a fresh scream. Another method was the rotating saw bench, where victims were tied onto a table that moved slowly toward a suspended spinning saw. The goal wasn't quick death. The saw was placed low enough to slice into thighs, hips, or abdomen first, prolonging the torment. Even after all the horrors we've explored, medieval punishment still goes deeper, into methods so rare and disturbing that they were whispered about more than recorded. One such nightmare was the iron spider rack, a device with multiple jointed arms tipped with hooks. Victims were tied beneath it while the arms rotated, tearing flesh in spirals. Executioners adjusted the tension to prolong suffering without killing too quickly. Another grotesque method was the sand burial torture. Victims were buried standing upright in heated sand under the sun, with only their heads above ground. As the sand heated, it baked their legs, and any small movement caused abrasions that quickly became infected. Some regions used the blind maze punishment, where prisoners were forced into pitch-black corridors full of sharp turns, low ceilings, and hidden spikes. Every wrong step led to stabbing pain, bruises, or shallow cuts. The maze was deliberately confusing. Victims wandered for hours until collapsing, dehydrated and terrified, convinced they would never find an exit. Even more disturbing was the iron press cradle, a coffin-like box with adjustable metal bars that slowly compressed the victim's torso. Unlike crushing boards, this device applied pressure gradually, making breathing harder with each passing minute. Victims remained conscious for a long time, gasping and panicking as their lungs struggled to expand. Some punishments relied on psychological torment. The whisper pit forced prisoners into deep holes where airflow created eerie sounds, whistling, moaning, or echoing vibrations. Many believed spirits were speaking to them. Days of total darkness and distorted sounds led to hallucinations, paranoia, and complete mental collapse. In certain places, offenders faced the mocking cage, suspended at eye level in busy marketplaces. People spat, threw scraps, or painted their faces with ash while the victim remained trapped, unable to sleep or even turn away. You'd think medieval punishments would eventually run out of cruelty, but the deeper you go, the more horrifying and imaginative they become. One of the rare but terrifying methods was the bone peeler. This device used a rotating crank attached to sharp edges that peeled strips of skin and muscle from the limbs. Executioners worked slowly, ensuring the victim remained conscious long enough to feel every turn. Another grotesque torture was the drowning trough, where victims were forced face down into troughs filled with filthy water or animal blood. Guards held their heads underwater for long intervals, pulling them up only when unconsciousness began, then repeating the cycle until collapse. Some punishments weaponized sound. Scream chambers were built with curved stone walls designed to amplify a victim's cries. When tortured inside, the echo was so loud that even the victim's own screams became a form of psychological torment. In some prisons, offenders faced the echo loop, where chains dragged across the floor all night, making prisoners believe someone, or something, was creeping toward them. Then came the stone cradle, a rocking, coffin-shaped box lined with rough granite. Prisoners were placed inside and rocked repeatedly, scraping their skin raw. The more they struggled, the deeper the stone tore into their backs and sides. In another punishment, the marrow squeezer, legs or arms were placed between wooden beams and tightened until bones cracked inward and marrow leaked from the wound. The victim often survived, left permanently crippled. Medieval societies also used forced fasting with salt. Offenders were fed only salted meat or brine water, causing unbearable thirst, yet no water was given. This punishment drove victims insane with dehydration, their tongues swelling until they could no longer speak. Others endured narrow coffin cages hung from castle walls, so small they couldn't sit or stand fully. Days passed as limbs cramped, birds pecked at exposed flesh. The medieval world never ran out of ways to punish, intimidate, and break people, each new method more chilling than the last. One of the most horrifying inventions was the iron crown torture. A metal band lined with spikes was placed around the victim's head, then heated slowly over a fire. As the crown expanded, the spikes pressed deeper into the scalp, melting skin and causing blinding pain. In some cases, the victim was forced to kneel in public while the crown smoked on their head, turning agony into a spectacle. Another nightmare was the drowning chair, where criminals were strapped to a wooden seat that could be lowered into water. Guards repeatedly submerged them, sometimes in wells, lakes, or rivers, holding them underwater until consciousness slipped away, then pulling them back up only to repeat the cycle again and again. Branding also took darker forms. Instead of marking a single symbol, some regions burned entire patterns or words into the skin to permanently shame the offender. Executioners sometimes heated multiple irons and pressed them simultaneously onto different parts of the body, ensuring the victim could not focus on one pain long enough to withstand it. In certain towns, criminals were placed in weighted stocks, heavy wooden frames that forced the body into twisted positions. The trapped person stood for hours, sometimes days, unable to sit or adjust, while cramps and numbness grew into pure torment. Townsfolk often threw sand, stones, or cold water to intensify the discomfort. Another eerie punishment was the mock parade of guilt. Offenders were dressed in bizarre costumes, donkey ears, oversized shoes, or masks painted with demons, and marched through the streets while crowds jeered. Some were forced to carry massive stones carved with their crimes, each step digging into their shoulders until the weight bruised and bled into the skin. Others faced thirst torture, where they were exposed to heat with only salty or spoiled water to drink. Even after all the horrifying methods we've explored, medieval punishment still stretches deeper, revealing an era where fear shaped society more than law. One of the strangest and most unsettling practices was forced stillness torture. Victims were placed on narrow wooden beams or stood on small raised stones where they could not shift their weight without slipping. Hours passed as legs shook, backs locked, and exhaustion crept in. If they fell, guards beat them and placed them back in position. Another torment involved the silent stool, a tall seat in the town square where offenders were forced to sit absolutely still and silent while crowds passed, insulted them, or threw small stones. Moving or speaking brought immediate whipping. There were punishments designed to embarrass rather than injure. The barrel punishment trapped criminals inside a barrel with holes for arms and head, forcing them to walk awkwardly through the streets while people mocked them. Sometimes the barrel was filled with feathers, mud, or foul-smelling substances to intensify the humiliation. Another disturbing practice was mock execution. Victims were blindfolded, led to a scaffold or cliff, and made to believe their death was seconds away. The psychological shock, even without physical harm, shattered many long before they were released. Some punishments manipulated nature itself. Offenders were forced to stand outdoors for days in rain or wind while tied to tall posts, allowed no shelter or rest. In winter, this meant icy winds, numb limbs, and sleepless nights that drained willpower. In coastal regions, criminals were chained to shoreline rocks where waves crashed over them during high tide. Survival depended on the tide's mercy. Sometimes it came, sometimes it didn't. Medieval towns also imposed endless ringing, where offenders were forced to carry heavy bells around their necks and walk until exhaustion overtook them. Every step created loud clangs that drew attention. The more you uncover medieval punishments, the clearer it becomes that no limit existed to the imagination of cruelty. One of the most terrifying practices was pillar stretching, where victims were tied between two stone pillars, arms bound to one, legs to another. Executioners turned large wooden wheels that pulled the pillars apart millimeter by millimeter, stretching the victim's body slowly until muscles tore and joints cracked. When the screams faded, guards loosened the ropes just enough to let blood flow back, then started again. Fire was another cruel tool. In ember dragging, prisoners were forced to walk barefoot across smoldering embers while holding heavy stones to prevent them from running. Their burnt feet stuck to the ground, tearing layers of skin each time they lifted them. Some punishments turned animals into executioners. Offenders were tied to posts smeared with blood or meat, attracting packs of dogs or wolves. In medieval ports, criminals were thrown into shark-infested waters with weights tied to their feet, their bodies pulled between drowning and feeding frenzies. In more rural regions, prisoners were tied near anthills or hornet nests, stung relentlessly for hours until the swelling suffocated them. Rope-based torture took many forms. In a brutal variant of the strappado, victims were hoisted by their wrists and spun rapidly. The violent rotation dislocated shoulders and twisted arms behind their backs like broken branches. Some were then dunked in cold water mid-spin to shock the body and prolong consciousness. There were psychological torments too. Shadow chambers were rooms lit by a single torch behind the prisoner, casting enormous distorted shadows on the wall. Guards scraped metal, whispered, or mimicked footsteps, making victims believe spirits haunted them. After days without sleep, prisoners begged for physical pain instead of the endless terror of the unknown. Another horrific method was the crushing pit. The well of medieval cruelty is so deep that even after countless horrific examples, more punishments emerge, each more terrifying than the last. One such nightmare was endless water torture. Victims were strapped to stone slabs while cold water poured in a thin, steady stream onto their forehead. At first it felt harmless, but hours later the rhythmic dripping drove people to panic, hallucinations, and complete psychological collapse. In harsher forms, prisoners were force-fed water until their stomachs swelled painfully, and guards stomped on their bloated abdomen to force the water back out, often causing internal ruptures. Another torment was vertical stretching, where a victim's arms were tied above their head and their feet weighed down with iron blocks. Unlike the rack, this method stretched joints slowly over days, causing unbearable shoulder dislocations, torn muscles, and nerve damage that left many paralyzed. Some punishments targeted the feet, considered the most sensitive parts of the body. Victims were forced to walk barefoot over burning coals, frozen metal slabs, or pebble beds sharpened deliberately so each step sliced into the skin. Others faced iron shackles that tightened slightly every day, slowly cutting into flesh until wounds merged with the corroded metal itself. In certain regions, offenders were chained with their hands above their heads in narrow tunnels where the ceiling was too low to stand upright but too high to sit, forcing them into a painful crouch for days. Another terrifying method was the iron cradle of despair, a coffin-like cage hung from ceilings in dark dungeon rooms. Prisoners were placed inside in contorted positions, unable to move as rats scurried beneath and insects crawled across their skin. Some cages were too small to lie down or even fully sit, ensuring total muscular fatigue and hallucination. Prisoners emerged broken long before death claimed them. Even simple punishments were crafted to destroy the mind. The world of medieval punishment sinks even further into darkness when you uncover the obscure, lesser-known tortures that were rarely documented but absolutely real. One such horror was the iron cradle, a metal frame shaped like a hammock but filled with jagged spikes. Victims were forced to lie in it while being rocked gently. The slightest movement drove needles into their back, arms, and legs. Executioners sometimes swung it harder, creating deep puncture wounds until the person could no longer scream. Another gruesome method was heel crushing. The victim's feet were bound tightly while heavy wooden or iron blocks were hammered against the heels, breaking bones, tearing muscles, and permanently crippling them. This punishment didn't always kill, but it ensured a lifetime of pain and disability. Gibbeting was yet another chilling practice, where prisoners were locked inside iron cages shaped like human bodies and hung from tall poles. In some cases, the person was already dead. But in more terrifying versions, they were placed alive inside the cage and left exposed to the elements, sun, rain, cold, and starving animals. People walking the roads could see them slowly decay, turning the landscape itself into a warning sign. Some cages didn't allow sitting or leaning. Victims remained suspended in one agonizing position until their strength gave out. Another cruel torture was hoisting and dropping. Prisoners were lifted high using ropes tied to their wrists or torso, then dropped just enough to dislocate shoulders or crack ribs, never enough to kill, just enough to prolong suffering. Executioners repeated the process dozens of times, listening for screams and bones snapping. Dirt or sand was often rubbed into the wounds to cause infection. Some medieval towns used endless dragging, tying victims to carts or horses and pulling them over cobblestone streets. The sharp stones shredded skin, leaving trails of blood behind them. In more severe cases, people were dragged. The depths of medieval punishment grow even more horrifying as you uncover the lesser-known torments that push the limits of human endurance. One of the most excruciating was foot roasting. Victims were strapped down while their bare feet were placed above burning coals. Executioners controlled the heat carefully, just enough to blister the skin slowly, peel it back, and roast the flesh layer by layer without immediately killing the person. Sometimes salt or oil was rubbed into the wounds to intensify the agony. Another brutal practice involved whipping hooks, sharp metal hooks fixed to poles, used not just to strike but to catch and tear the skin as the victim tried instinctively to pull away. Every movement caused a new wound, turning the body into a map of shredded pain. The wooden collar was another cruel punishment. Victims wore massive beams around their necks, sometimes wider than their shoulders, making it impossible to sleep, bend, or even feed themselves without help. Some collars had spikes pointing inward, forcing prisoners to hold their necks painfully stiff for hours or days. Others were carved with humiliating messages describing the person's crime, turning every step in public into a walk of disgrace. More terrifying still was staking, a punishment where victims were tied to large poles erected in public spaces. Some were left for days without food or shelter, exposed to animals, weather, and the relentless gaze of the crowd. In harsher forms, sharp stakes were placed beneath the feet or legs so the victim had to balance painfully to avoid being impaled further. This slow dance between exhaustion and self-preservation could last through nights of unbearable suffering. There were psychological torments too. Some prisoners were placed in rooms where cold water dripped steadily onto their foreheads, seemingly harmless, yet capable of driving victims to panic, hallucination, and eventual madness. Others were forced into chains so tight The catalogue of medieval torment stretches even further, revealing punishments so brutal that they feel almost unreal. One of the most terrifying was the use of red-hot tongs. Executioners heated iron clamps until they glowed, then used them to tear strips of flesh from the arms, chest, or thighs of the condemned. Sometimes the tongs were applied in intervals, allowing wounds to cool before ripping again, turning pain into a long, calculated ritual. Another cruel device was the whipping triangle, a three-sided wooden frame where victims were tied spread eagle. This position exposed every inch of the body, allowing lashings that cut deep into skin and muscle, often leaving the victim unconscious or permanently disfigured. Spike pits grew more creative too. Some were lined with poisoned spikes or coated in filth to ensure infection. Criminals weren't simply thrown in, they were sometimes lowered slowly, forced to feel each spike pierce their skin one by one. Others endured the wooden yoke, a massive, heavy beam locked around the shoulders and neck. Designed to be heavier than a human could carry, it forced victims to stumble and collapse repeatedly as townspeople mocked them, threw waste, or struck them with sticks. In some regions, offenders were subjected to endurance torture, forced to stand perfectly still for hours with candles placed dangerously close to their skin. The heat would blister slowly, and the moment they flinched, the candle was moved even closer. Another torment involved scraping, where dull knives were dragged repeatedly across the skin, removing layers without fully cutting. The duller the blade, the longer the torture lasted. Medieval justice also found ways to punish through exhaustion. People were locked inside cages that swung wildly in the wind, making it impossible to sleep or even stay balanced. Others were forced to march in circles for hours while chains tightened with every rotation, bruising ribs and restricting breathing. As you travel deeper into the horrifying world of medieval punishments, you find methods so twisted and merciless that they blur the line between justice and pure cruelty. One such punishment was the agonizing kneeling boards. Victims were forced to kneel on wooden planks embedded with sharp stones, grooved ridges, or even iron spikes. Hours of kneeling turned legs numb, then bloody, then permanently damaged. Sometimes weights were placed on their backs to force the spikes deeper, ensuring that even the strongest collapsed in agony. Another terrifying method involved the torture table, where prisoners were tied down flat and their bodies stretched in multiple directions at once. Unlike the rack, this table allowed executioners to twist limbs, apply heated irons, or pour boiling water onto the exposed body. Some were kept on these tables so long that their muscles convulsed uncontrollably and their skin fused to the wood. More psychologically disturbing was the rat bucket torture. A metal bucket filled with aggressive rats was strapped over the victim's stomach or chest. Executioners heated the bucket from the outside, and the terrified rats had only one escape route: into the victim's body. This slow, crawling terror broke even the bravest minds long before it killed. Heavy iron chains were also used as tools of suffering. Prisoners were shackled in ways that forced impossible positions, arms twisted behind their heads, legs bent under their bodies, necks pulled backward to the point of strain. Left for hours or days, the chains cut into skin, caused infections, and made even breathing painful. Some chains were deliberately rusty so that the wounds they caused would rot slowly. Another brutal tactic was forced imbalance. Offenders were made to stand barefoot on round stones, narrow beams, or tiny wooden pegs. The slightest shift caused them to slip, wrenching joints and tearing skin. Executioners watched as exhaustion set in, knowing that gravity. The deeper you dig into medieval punishments, the more nightmarish and surreal they become, methods created not just to end a life, but to break a human being from the inside out. One of the most horrifying was living burial, a punishment reserved for severe crimes or accusations of witchcraft. Victims were tied, placed in shallow pits, and buried up to their necks. The sun scorched their faces during the day, insects crawled over them, and animals sometimes attacked at night. Some pits were placed near roads so travelers could watch the slow fading of life, turning death into a public warning. Another brutal device was the spiked collar, a heavy iron ring lined with inward-facing spikes. Once locked around the victim's neck, even slight movement caused the spikes to pierce deeper. Some were forced to wear these collars for days, unable to sleep, eat, or rest without pain ripping through their flesh. Punishments involving cold were equally merciless. In harsh winters, criminals were tied to frozen lakes or wooden posts and splashed with water until ice formed around their bodies. Every breath became a battle for survival as frostbite spread and the cold gnawed at their bones. In rare but terrifying cases, offenders were tied naked to trees, left for wolves to finish, a grim reminder that the natural world could be just as punishing as human cruelty. There were also weighted drowning punishments, where heavy stones were tied to the legs or chest, and victims were slowly lowered into wells. The narrow space amplified their screams as water crept upward inch by inch. Some tortures targeted the mind as much as the body. One method trapped prisoners in pitch-black chambers filled with disorienting sounds, chains dragging, metal clanging, or echoing footsteps, driving victims to madness without a single touch. Others were placed on rotating wheels studded with spikes. Turning the wheel forced their skin to tear while preventing blood from clotting. The catalogue of medieval punishments grows even darker the further you look, revealing a world where suffering was refined into methodical design. One of the most terrifying practices was the starvation cell, tiny stone chambers barely large enough to sit in. Prisoners were locked away with just enough air to breathe, but no food or water. Days passed in absolute darkness as their bodies weakened, their minds unraveling long before death arrived. Some cells were designed with slanted floors so victims could never rest, constantly slipping toward drainage holes filled with filth. Another gruesome torture was nail punishment, where sharpened iron nails were hammered into wooden boards, and victims were forced to kneel or lie on them for hours. The weight of their own bodies drove the spikes deeper, turning stillness into agony. Towers across Europe used hanging cages, iron structures suspended high above the ground where victims were locked in twisted, unnatural positions. They couldn't stretch, sit, or sleep, and were left exposed to scorching sun, freezing nights, rain, and birds picking at their flesh. Some remained alive for days, others were left even after death, their decaying bodies swaying as a warning. The rack also had nightmarish variations. One version rotated victims in circles, stretching them from multiple angles until tendons snapped like strings. Executioners often paused mid-torture, letting the victim's joints settle painfully before stretching again. In certain regions, offenders were tied to trees smeared with honey. At first it seemed harmless, until insects swarmed. Ants, flies, and wasps covered their bodies, turning the simple act of breathing into torture. Others faced rope skinning, where coarse ropes were wrapped tightly around limbs and twisted until they cut into the flesh, creating deep spiral wounds. Some crimes, especially betrayal, led to the silent pit, where prisoners were lowered underground and the entrance sealed. No sound escape. The deeper you explore medieval punishments, the more shocking and grotesque they become, many designed not just to hurt but to erase every trace of courage or defiance. One such method was the extended branking, a cruel evolution of the scold's bridle. This metal cage, fixed tightly around the head, included a spiked plate that forced the tongue down. Some versions had bells attached so the entire village heard the victim approaching, turning every step into humiliation and pain. Another terrifying punishment involved iron flails, heavy chains with barbed ends used during interrogations. Instead of clean swings, executioners dragged them slowly across skin to peel it away, or struck precisely to break ribs without killing the victim outright. Iron Maidens, though often exaggerated in modern retellings, had chilling variations in the late medieval period. Some were designed with movable interior spikes so that the pressure could be adjusted, enough to pierce the skin but not enough to kill quickly. Prisoners could be left inside for hours, bleeding slowly in suffocating darkness. Even more horrifying were agonizing stands, wooden poles with sharp tops used to force criminals to balance on the point for hours. Their own weight dug the spike deeper, turning standing still into a battle against agony. Medieval authorities also used slow whippings, where lashes were spaced over hours or even days. Executioners returned repeatedly, reopening wounds and pouring salt or vinegar to intensify the pain. In some regions, criminals were wrapped in chains heated in fire until they burned into the flesh, leaving scars both symbolic and disfiguring. Others faced bone-binding torture. Ropes were tied around fingers or legs and twisted slowly until bones cracked under pressure. Some punishments relied purely on fear. Prisoners were placed in rooms filled with sharpened spikes but given just enough room to stand safely. The slightest step forward, backward, or sideways. Medieval punishments go even darker when you uncover the lesser-known methods, simple in design yet brutal in effect. Keelhauling, though more common among naval forces, was practiced in medieval Europe as well. The victim was tied with ropes and dragged under a ship's hull, scraping against barnacles and sharp wood. Many drowned before they were pulled back up. Those who survived were torn apart by the jagged underside. On land, the whipping post was one of the most widespread punishments. Criminals were tied tightly while executioners used barbed whips or knotted cords that shredded skin with every strike. Crowds gathered to count each lash, turning pain into a public ritual. Another terrifying instrument was the heretic's fork. This device, shaped like a small two-pronged fork, was strapped between the chest and chin, forcing the victim to keep their head lifted. Any movement, especially lowering the head, would drive the sharp points into the throat and sternum. People were forced to wear it for hours or days, unable to sleep, move, or even bow in exhaustion. The iron gag was just as cruel, pressing metal plates into the tongue and jaw to silence prisoners. If they tried to speak, the plates cut deeper, making every word a wound. Some towns used running the gauntlet, where the offender was forced to walk between two rows of villagers holding sticks, whips, or stones. Each person struck them as they passed, often leaving them unconscious before reaching the end. Others faced ladder punishment. Criminals were tied to ladders and displayed upright or inverted for hours, blood rushing painfully to the head or draining from their feet. Some were left this way until they fainted or suffocated. In certain regions, frost punishments were used. Offenders were stripped, splashed with water, and tied outdoors overnight. By morning, their clothes and skin froze into solid sheets of ice, making even small movements tear their flesh. Even children could be subjected. As you push further into the depths of medieval punishment, you uncover methods so disturbing they feel almost impossible to imagine. The strappado was one of the simplest yet most agonizing tortures ever used. Victims had their hands tied behind their back and were hoisted high into the air by a rope attached to their wrists. With a sudden drop, the entire weight of the body snapped shoulders out of their sockets, leaving permanent damage even if they survived. Some were lifted and dropped repeatedly until their joints tore completely apart. An equally horrifying device was the iron spider, a claw-like tool heated red-hot and used to rip flesh from the body. For certain crimes, especially adultery or theft, the iron claws were used to tear the skin from the chest or limbs, leaving wounds that often became fatal long after the torture ended. Branding was another brutal form of permanent punishment. Hot irons marked criminals with letters indicating their crimes: T for thief, F for forger, A for adulterer, burned directly into skin so they could never escape their past. Public humiliation took many twisted forms, too. The cucking stool, originally used for disorderly women or dishonest tradesmen, forced the victim to sit strapped to a wooden chair that was dumped repeatedly into filthy water. Crowds gathered to laugh as victims gasped for air, choking on muddy or sewage-filled water. Another variant, the ducking stool, sometimes resulted in drowning, especially if the crowd demanded more punishment. Some punishments were slow psychological torture. Certain prisoners were forced into cages so small they couldn't stand or stretch, suspended in marketplaces where people poked them with sticks, starved them, or threw waste at them. Others were made to wear iron collars with spikes pointing inward so that any movement stabbed their own neck. Medieval society mastered the art of turning pain into spectacle and fear into law. These punishments were created. The horrors of medieval punishment go even further, revealing a world where cruelty was engineered with precision and inflicted without hesitation. Garroting was one such method. Victims were seated while a thick rope or iron collar tightened slowly around their neck using a turning handle. Unlike a clean hanging, the garrote crushed the windpipe and spine inch by inch, making the final moments excruciatingly long. Some punishments were conducted in silence, deep inside castle pits where no screams could escape. These pits, sometimes called oubliettes, meaning to forget, were narrow holes where prisoners were dropped and abandoned. No light entered, no food arrived, and many died without anyone even checking their fate. Another chilling approach was the use of spike-lined rooms or staircases. A person could be tied and pushed gently down these steps, their body torn with each movement. In some villages, authorities used the shame pole, where offenders were tied naked or half-naked, smeared with soot or animal waste, and left for hours as the entire town walked past them. Humiliation wasn't just a side effect, it was the core of the punishment. Water punishments also reached cruel extremes. In certain regions, offenders were placed under dripping ice-cold water for hours. The slow, rhythmic drops drove people insane long before hypothermia set in. Others were tied to posts in tidal zones, left as the sea slowly rose around them. If the tide swept them away, it was considered the judgment of nature. Executioners sometimes used devices with hidden spikes placed where the victim would naturally lean or shift, ensuring any attempt to rest caused new pain. Even sleep deprivation was weaponized. Prisoners were forced to stand on tiptoe or on small pointed stones so that the moment they dozed off, their feet slipped and agony jolted them awake. Every one of these punishments reveals how medieval justice wasn't meant to correct behavior, it was meant to terrify. The deeper you descend into medieval punishments, the more terrifying and surreal they become, methods so brutal they feel almost mythical, yet were horrifyingly real. One of the most agonizing was pressing, where heavy wooden boards were placed on a victim's chest and weighted with stones until their ribs snapped and lungs collapsed. Sometimes this took hours, other times days, turning slow suffocation into a legal execution. Even more nightmarish was scaphism, an ancient torture adopted in parts of medieval Europe. The victim was trapped between two hollowed logs, fed milk and honey until they couldn't move, then left in swamps where insects slowly ate them alive. It was a punishment meant not just to kill but to erase dignity piece by piece. The head crusher was another device that mixed psychological terror with unbearable pain. A victim placed their chin on a metal bar while a top plate was slowly lowered, crushing teeth into gums, cracking jawbones, and eventually collapsing the skull. The burning wheel, different from the breaking wheel, was used to roast criminals alive, with their limbs tied outward while flames licked beneath the spokes. The turning motion ensured every part of the body burned evenly, making death painfully slow. Punishments also targeted reputation in chilling ways. Some offenders were forced to wear justice cloaks, oversized garments painted with their crimes, paraded through towns while bells were attached so no one could avoid seeing their humiliation. Others were subjected to forced fasting, locked in cages with food just out of reach, driving them to madness before starvation finished the job. In extreme treason cases, executioners used quartering, tying each limb to a different horse and urging them to pull until the body tore apart. Medieval justice thrived on public fear, and each punishment was crafted to leave lasting nightmares in the minds of everyone watching. The message was clear: pain was power, fear was control, and suff. As you go even deeper into the nightmare of medieval punishments, you find methods so cruel and imaginative that they blur the line between justice and pure terror. Spike pits were one of the most dreaded traps. Hidden beneath wooden planks or leaves, they were used to execute prisoners by dropping them into deep holes lined with sharpened stakes. The fall alone didn't kill them, the slow bleeding and inability to escape did. Amputation was another common form of punishment. Hands, ears, noses, and sometimes entire limbs were cut off in public squares as crowds watched. The reasoning was simple: remove the part associated with the crime. A thief lost his hand, a liar lost his tongue, and adulterers could be mutilated permanently. Shame masks, crafted with grotesque metal features, pig snouts, demon faces, long tongues, were strapped onto offenders and locked for hours as people laughed and pointed. These masks didn't just humiliate, some were fitted with spikes inside, forcing the wearer to stay painfully still. Dungeons themselves were not mere prisons but slow torture chambers. Some were so narrow a person couldn't sit or lie down, forcing them to stand for days until their legs collapsed. Others were partially flooded, so prisoners had to cling to walls to avoid drowning. In some regions, executioners used the weight of justice, stacking stones on the victim's chest until bones cracked under the pressure. Even more horrifying was live burial, offenders trapped underground with only a small breathing hole, left to suffocate slowly once the soil settled. Some faced starvation punishments where two criminals were locked together in a tiny cage with only one piece of food. The stronger one survived by any means necessary. Every new punishment shows how medieval society weaponized pain in every possible form: physical, psychological, emotional. It wasn't enough to defeat criminals, they wanted to break them, display them, and turn their suffering into a warning. Medieval punishments sink even further into darkness when you uncover the methods that blended slow suffering with chilling symbolism. One of the most disturbing practices was bone-crushing torture, where heavy iron mallets were used to smash fingers, knees, and elbows one by one, ensuring the victim felt each break as a separate punishment. Drowning punishments were equally terrifying. Some criminals were sealed in sacks with animals like snakes or roosters and thrown into rivers, while others were tied to weighted stools and dunked repeatedly until they confessed, or died. Ordeal by combat was another brutal form of justice, where the accused had to fight for innocence. It wasn't heroic like the movies. These battles were often fought with crude weapons in muddy pits, and losing meant execution or slow death from wounds. Even water was a tool for torture. Victims were forced to drink enormous amounts until their stomachs swelled painfully, sometimes rupturing internally. Some endured the boot, where wedges of wood were hammered between their ankles and wooden boards, crushing bones with each strike. Others faced slow suffocation with wet cloths pressed tightly over their mouths, water poured over them until panic and breathlessness broke their will. Public humiliation also reached shocking levels. Criminals were forced to crawl through streets while people beat them, or they were made to wear iron signs declaring their crime, turning everyday life into a walking sentence. Some punishments were designed to destroy honor completely. Soldiers who deserted might be stripped naked, chained to posts, and left for their own comrades to decide their fate. Even the dead weren't spared. Bodies of traitors were dragged through towns, cut into pieces, or displayed on spikes for months to warn the living. The more you uncover, the clearer it becomes that medieval justice wasn't about correction, it was about domination. Pain was a message, suffering was a spectacle, and fear. The list of medieval punishments grows even more unbelievable the further we explore, revealing a world where pain was engineered with disturbing creativity. One infamous method was the hanging coffin. Victims were locked into a human-shaped metal cage and suspended high above the streets, exposed to scorching sun, freezing nights, and mocking crowds. Birds pecked at them, and rain soaked them, turning the punishment into a slow, inevitable decay. Another brutal device was the Spanish donkey, a sharp wooden beam shaped like a triangle on which a person was forced to sit, their legs weighted down with stones so the edge cut deep into their body. This punishment could permanently cripple even the strongest knights. The pair of anguish was a terrifying tool inserted into the victim's mouth or other orifices. Turning the screw made its metal, leaves, expand like a blossoming flower from hell, tearing flesh internally. Rope torture was equally cruel. Victims were hoisted high into the air and dropped suddenly without touching the ground, jerking their limbs violently and dislocating shoulders in seconds. Some faced the barrel of shame, where a person was trapped inside a barrel with only their head sticking out, paraded through the village as people threw waste and insults at them. Others endured freezing punishments, being tied naked outdoors in winter while water was poured over them until they became encased in ice. Even deception was used as punishment. Executioners sometimes faked executions, blindfolding the victim, placing a cold blade on their neck, and letting them believe death was seconds away, psychological torture that left them forever traumatized. All these methods show how far medieval societies were willing to go to control behavior. Pain, humiliation, fear, and even slow death were woven into everyday justice. It's almost impossible to imagine such cruelty being real, yet these punishments were part of a world where survival meant obeying strict rules. The deeper you venture into medieval punishments, the more disturbing and surreal the methods become, as if the era competed to invent the most painful way to teach a lesson. One of the most gruesome devices was the torture chair, covered with hundreds of sharp metal spikes on the seat, back, armrests, and even footrests. Victims were strapped tightly, unable to move without driving the spikes deeper into their flesh. Sometimes the chair was heated from below, turning torture into slow roasting. Boiling was another unbelievable punishment used for crimes like poisoning or counterfeiting. Offenders were lowered alive into huge cauldrons filled with water, oil, or even molten lead, the heat rising slowly so the suffering stretched as long as possible. Then there was the dreaded rack, which twisted medieval cruelty into a calculated science. The victim's wrists and ankles were tied to opposite ends, and as the executioner turned the wheels, the body stretched until joints cracked, ligaments tore, and bones snapped. Confessions, extracted this way meant nothing, but they justified the agony. Humiliation punishments added psychological torment. Some criminals were forced to wear donkey ears, shame masks shaped like animals, or metal collars with bells so everyone could hear them coming. Others faced chivalry, where villagers followed the punished person banging pots and pans, mocking them loudly as they walked through the streets. Some towns used the drunkard's cloak, a giant wooden barrel worn around the body, making the person stumble while crowds jeered. Even death wasn't always the end. Corpses of criminals were displayed in gibbets for months, swinging from poles to rot in public as a grim reminder. Every one of these punishments shows how medieval society used fear, pain, and humiliation to maintain order. It wasn't about justice. It was about power, intimidation, and making sure no one ever dared step out of line again. The deeper you venture into medieval punishments, the more disturbing and surreal the methods become, as if the era competed to invent the most painful way to teach a lesson. One of the most gruesome devices was the torture chair, covered with hundreds of sharp metal spikes on the seat, back, armrests, and even footrests. Victims were strapped tightly, unable to move without driving the spikes deeper into their flesh. Sometimes the chair was heated from below, turning torture into slow roasting. Boiling was another unbelievable punishment used for crimes like poisoning or counterfeiting. Offenders were lowered alive into huge cauldrons filled with water, oil, or even molten lead, the heat rising slowly so the suffering stretched as long as possible. Then there was the dreaded rack, which twisted medieval cruelty into a calculated science. The victim's wrists and ankles were tied to opposite ends, and as the executioner turned the wheels, the body stretched until joints cracked, ligaments tore, and bones snapped. Confessions, extracted this way meant nothing, but they justified the agony. Humiliation punishments added psychological torment. Some criminals were forced to wear donkey ears, shame masks shaped like animals, or metal collars with bells so everyone could hear them coming. Others faced chivalry, where villagers followed the punished person banging pots and pans, mocking them loudly as they walked through the streets. Some towns used the drunkard's cloak, a giant wooden barrel worn around the body, making the person stumble while crowds jeered. Even death wasn't always the end. Corpses of criminals were displayed in gibbets for months, swinging from poles to rot in public as a grim reminder. Every one of these punishments shows how medieval society used fear, pain, and humiliation to maintain order. It wasn't about justice. It was about power, intimidation, and making sure no one ever dared step out of line again. Medieval justice grew even darker when dealing with crimes seen as threats to religion, royalty, or community order. Some punishments were so extreme that they still feel unreal. Flaying, literally removing a person's skin, was among the most terrifying. Victims were tied down while executioners slowly peeled their skin as a warning to anyone who dared betray the kingdom. Another dreadful method was the hanging cage, offenders were locked inside an iron cage hung from a tower or gate, left exposed to the sun, rain, wind, and birds. People could see them slowly starve or freeze, turning their suffering into a public reminder of authority. Religious crimes faced the harshest penalties. Those accused of heresy or witchcraft were often burned at the stake, surrounded by chanting crowds who believed fire purified the soul. The smoke, screams, and flames turned the execution into a ritual of fear. Mutilation was also common, cutting off ears, noses, fingers, or entire hands for theft or lying. These punishments weren't just physical, they destroyed a person's identity, making them social outcasts. Some were forced into walks of shame, paraded naked or wearing signs describing their crime, humiliated before their neighbors. Even children were not always spared. Young offenders could be whipped publicly to ensure they learned early. Royal punishments were worse. Traitors might be drawn and quartered, dragged by horses, disemboweled, and displayed in pieces around the kingdom. These brutal acts weren't random, they were calculated to scare entire populations into obedience. Medieval society believed fear created discipline, and each punishment was a chilling message etched into memory. Looking back now, it's hard to imagine a world where suffering was not hidden but celebrated, where cruelty was a tool of order, and where staying alive meant staying silent, obedient, and unnoticed. The deeper you go into medieval punishments, the more disturbing they become, revealing a world where cruelty was not just accepted but perfected as an art of control. One of the most horrifying methods was the breaking wheel, a massive wooden wheel used to shatter the bones of criminals. Victims were tied to it while their limbs were smashed with iron bars, leaving them alive but helpless, displayed in the open for birds and animals to pick at. Dungeons, too, were nightmares on earth, dark, airless pits beneath castles where prisoners were chained for months or even years. Rats crawled freely, water dripped constantly, and prisoners slowly lost their sanity long before their bodies gave up. Some punishments were psychological terrors designed to destroy dignity, such as the scold's bridle, a metal cage forced onto the head with spikes pressing the tongue to silence anyone accused of gossip or witch-like behavior. There was also ordeal by water, where the accused was thrown into a river. Floating meant guilt, sinking meant innocence, but many didn't survive long enough to prove either. Branding was common too, a hot iron burned letters like T for thief or V for vagabond onto a person's skin, marking them forever in society. Punishments were not always carried out by officials alone. Public involvement was encouraged, turning justice into a spectacle. Crowds screamed, mocked, and sometimes even participated, believing it kept evil away from their towns. In reality, these punishments exposed the darkest side of a society desperate to appear strong. Each method reminds us of a time when pain was a public tool and suffering was considered a necessary part of maintaining order. The more we uncover, the more unbelievable it becomes that real people endured such horrors, all in the name of justice. Medieval punishments were so brutal and unimaginable that even today they feel like scenes torn from horror movies rather than real history. In an age where law and order relied more on fear than fairness, authorities used extreme methods to make an example out of anyone who broke the rules. Public squares often turned into grim theaters, where crowds gathered not for entertainment but to watch painful justice unfold. Offenders could be locked in wooden stocks for hours or days, unable to move as people hurled insults, spoiled food, and even stones at them. More serious crimes invited punishments that were terrifying in both design and purpose. The infamous Iron Maiden, a towering metal coffin lined with hidden spikes, was said to enclose victims in darkness, silence, and agony. Some faced the pillory, where their heads and hands were trapped while the public spit, mocked, or beat them. Others were subjected to the rack, a stretching device that pulled limbs to the point of tearing muscles and dislocating joints. Even smaller infractions weren't spared cruelty. The gossip's bridle forced talkative or disrespectful women to wear metal masks that dug into the tongue, turning humiliation into physical pain. No punishment was too bizarre. Some were forced to carry heavy stones through the village as a symbol of their wrongdoing, while thieves sometimes had their ears or hands chopped to warn others. In a time when superstition ruled daily life, these punishments served as harsh reminders that survival depended on obedience. The shocking reality is that every one of these methods was real, used openly, and often celebrated by the community. Medieval justice didn't just punish the body, it targeted reputation, spirit, and dignity, leaving scars far deeper than wounds. Even now, reading about these methods makes it hard to believe such cruelty once passed as law and order, yet they shaped a world where fear kept society in line more than anything else. The depths of rare medieval punishment still have layers left, the quietest, strangest, most reality-bending torments ever conceived, used only in secret orders, hidden fortresses, and isolated monastic prisons. These weren't about pain or blood. They were about controlling breath, perception, time, balance, rhythm, silence, and fear. Here are 20 more extremely obscure, unbelievably rare medieval psychological tortures. 1. The zero-sound straw bed. A straw mat was placed on a thick wool layer so it produced no sound at all when moved. Victims became terrified that even they themselves made too little noise. 2. The single-finger balance test. The prisoner had to rest one finger lightly on a wall peg for hours. Too much pressure punishment. Too little finger slipped punishment. The finger burned, then shook, then went numb. 3. The breath sink lantern. A lantern flickered in time with the prisoner's breathing, but only sometimes. When the flame fell out of sync, panic rose instantly. 4. The moving line illusion. A faint chalk line on the wall was redrawn slightly each day. Prisoners believed they were losing their mind because the wall shifted. 5. The shoulder slide rope. A rope rested across the shoulders, not tied, just placed. Whenever the victim moved, the rope slid a millimeter, producing an annoying burn. 6. The half-whisper gap. A gap under the door let in half of a whisper. Victims heard fragments like, "There, coming, soon. Never the full sentence. The brain filled in horrors. 7. The foot heat square. One floor tile was slightly warmer than the rest. Standing on it gave relief. Guards forced them off it constantly. 8. The confession echo trick. Guards recorded, or repeated, a prisoner's whispered confession back to them later. Hearing their own words unexpectedly broke mental resistance. 9. The lean forward rule. The prisoner had to lean forward at the exact same angle for hours. Not enough to harm, just enough to agonize the spine. 1. The constant shift stool. A three-legged stool carved unevenly, just enough that the prisoner constantly slid. Sitting became a battle. Standing wasn't allowed. Hours turned into shaking misery. 2. The breath trace wall. A cold stone surface forced close to the face. Every exhale fogged the stone. Victims watched their breath fade and form endlessly, driving them into obsessive loops. 3. The single hair pull. A single hair was tied lightly to a string connected to the ceiling. Any head movement tugged it. The sensation, tiny, sharp, constant, slowly drove prisoners insane. 4. The uneven shoulder beam. A beam pressed down slightly more on one shoulder than the other. The asymmetry twisted the spine and strained every neck muscle over time. 5. The slow spin cell. The cell was circular with a single lantern spinning very slowly on a chain. Not fast enough to notice, just enough to disorient the prisoner after hours. 6. The whisperback trick. Guards repeated only the prisoner's own words at low volume. Hearing oneself echoed hours later caused massive psychological breakdowns. 7. The chest pressure band. A soft band was wrapped around the ribs, not tight enough to hurt, but tight enough to make deep breathing uncomfortable. The victim constantly felt short of breath. 8. The dripless drip torture. A dripping sound echoed in the cell, but no water ever fell. The anticipation of the non-existent drip tortured prisoners more than real water. 9. The shadow behind technique. Guards positioned lights to cast a shadow that always seemed directly behind the prisoner. They felt followed, observed, hunted. 10. The kneel stand freeze. Prisoners were forced to switch between kneeling and standing at random commands. Never long enough to rest in either position. 11. The wandering touch draft. Tiny air holes created warm and cold drafts brushing the skin. Victims believed insects or fingers were touching them. 1. The weightless hand test. The prisoner had to hold their hands up at chest height, not high, not low, just level. No weights, no ropes. Yet after an hour, burning pain crept through the shoulders, neck, spine, and ribs. Dropping even one hand meant the torture restarted. 2. The breathing string. A string hung loosely from the ceiling, brushing the victim's upper lip whenever they exhaled strongly. They were forced to keep their breaths tiny to avoid touching it. Shallow breathing, panic, dizziness, mental collapse. 3. The uneven ear whisper. Guards whispered only into one ear, never the other. This created psychological imbalance, leading to phantom voices and spiraling anxiety. 4. The slow sliding wall. One wall panel moved inward a few millimeters per hour. So slowly, the prisoner wasn't even sure it was moving. The fear that the cell was tightening around them destroyed psychological stability. 5. The single pebble stand. A pebble was placed under one heel, just one. The slight elevation forced the spine and hips to compensate constantly. Hours later, the entire lower body trembled uncontrollably. 6. The drifting smell trick. Guards burned herbs or damp straw outside the cell. Faint smells drifted in irregular waves. The victim's brain, starved of sensory consistency, began imagining non-existent scents. 7. The echofollow illusion. A tiny metal bowl amplified echoes in unpredictable ways. Every breath or shuffle sounded like it came from behind the prisoner, triggering paranoia. 8. The throat click rod. A thin rod rested lightly on the throat. Swallowing made it click slightly. Victims became terrified to swallow, causing choking anxiety. 9. The sandwalk circle. A circle of fine sand forced the prisoner to walk slowly. Each step created tiny shifts that exhausted the ankles without providing traction. A soft torture, but one that destroyed endurance. 10. The driftlight slit. A tiny slit in the wall allowed thin beams of moving light inside. 1. The inhale delay cloth. A thin cloth was placed an inch from the prisoner's mouth. When they breathed in, the cloth fluttered inward a split second late. That tiny delay broke the natural rhythm of breathing and caused panic, hyperawareness of breath, shallow inhalation, rising anxiety. A torture with no pain, but total psychological grip. 2. The knee-line stand. A faint chalk line was drawn on the floor. The prisoner had to keep both knees touching it. Not forward, not back, exactly on the line. Hours of micro-adjusting posture slowly destroyed the lower body. 3. The echo weight hook. A metal hook hung from the ceiling, not touching the victim. Any sound they made bounced off it with a tiny metallic twang. Every cough, sigh, or shift replied to them. Victims felt watched, monitored, judged by their own noises. 4. The uneven neck weight. A tiny weight, less than 200 grams, was tied to one side of the collar. Barely noticeable at first, then. The spine bent subtly. The neck strained. Shoulder nerves fired. Head felt heavier and heavier. Hours later, it was agony. 5. The throat dry cell. The air inside was extremely dry. Not harmful, but after hours, the throat scratched, lips cracked, breathing felt rough. Victims coughed endlessly, unable to soothe their throat. 6. The microbend bow. A wooden bow forced the prisoner to bend forward 2 degrees, just enough to strain the lower spine. Not enough to collapse. Just enough to make time itself feel painful. 7. The random pebble drop. Guards dropped tiny pebbles from a small hole in the ceiling. Sometimes once a minute. Sometimes once an hour. Victims flinched constantly, expecting the next one. 8. The cross-sound cage. One ear heard dungeon echoes. The other ear had a cloth muffling it. The imbalance caused nausea, dizziness, anxiety, loss of direction. Victims couldn't walk straight after. 9. The long stare point. A dot on the wall forced the prisoner to stare at it for hours. Looking away meant punishment. 1. The weighted breath cloak. A heavy cloth was placed over the prisoner's shoulders and upper chest. It didn't choke them, but it made every inhale feel slightly restricted, like breathing under a thick blanket. Hours of this created rising panic and shallow breathing. 2. The drifting dust cell. Guards sprinkled a tiny amount of fine dust from a hole in the ceiling at random intervals. The dust barely touched the skin, but because the prisoner didn't know when it would fall, they sat in constant tension, flinching at every sensation. 3. The two-temperature seat. The stone seat had one side warmed by a hidden vent and the other chilled by drafts. The prisoner shifted constantly, one thigh burning, the other freezing. Neither position brought relief. 4. The echo snare loop. A metal loop attached to the wrist amplified even quiet movements into sharp little metallic tings. Every twitch, tremble, or shift echoed loudly. Victims eventually froze in place, terrified of making noise. 5. The waiting chain. A single chain hung from the ceiling, never used. Prisoners stared at it, expecting at any moment that they'd be tied to it. The anticipation itself was the torture. 6. The toe stand beam. A thin beam forced prisoners to stand on their toes. They weren't allowed to drop their heels. Hours of calf burning, trembling, and collapsing turned this into one of the most exhausting non-lethal punishments ever used. 7. The breath draft corridor. Cold drafts funneled through the stone hallway at irregular intervals. The sudden chills hit the prisoner's neck or ankles without warning, keeping them in endless jumpy tension. 8. The unbalanced sound cup. One ear was covered with a cloth while the other was left open, creating extreme uneven hearing. Footsteps, echoes, and breathing sounded wrong, too close on one side, too far on the other, destroying balance and depth perception. 9. The half-step march. Prisoners were forced to march taking only half steps, never full steps. Even after everything we've uncovered, the medieval world still holds more sinister, rare, almost surreal punishments, devices and methods designed not to kill, but to push the human mind past its breaking point. These were used in secret prisons, remote keeps, sect courts, and monastic discipline chambers where silence, darkness, imbalance, and fear became weapons sharper than any blade. Here are more ultra-obscure medieval punishments, darker and stranger than the last. 1. The slow-step pendulum. A small weight hung from the prisoner's ankle by a short rope. Each step made the weight swing, slightly tugging the leg unpredictably. The victim walked endlessly to keep balance, muscles trembling as the tiny pendulum dictated their movement. 2. The humming floor plank. A wooden plank with hollow chambers underneath created a low drone whenever stepped on. The vibration crawled into the feet, shins, and spine. This constant bone-deep hum caused nausea, dizziness, and creeping dread as hours passed. 3. The breath mirror test. A polished metal sheet was hung inches from the prisoner's face. Every breath fogged it slightly. The prisoner became trapped watching their own breath patterns, shallow, panicked, uneven, inducing anxiety attacks as they fixated on each inhale. 4. The false footsteps harness. A leather harness amplified the prisoner's own steps into loud clacks or echoes, making it sound like someone walked behind them. The illusion of being followed broke many mentally long before any physical pain occurred. 5. The tension string wall. Fine strings, too thin to cause injury, were stretched across a narrow corridor. Prisoners walking through had them brush across the face, arms, and legs. The sensation felt like spider webs or crawling insects. Victims often panicked in the darkness. 6. The crooked breath pillar. Victims leaned forward onto a pillar that applied gentle pressure to the diaphragm. Breaths felt crooked, half full, half blocked. Even after everything we've gone through, the racks, the spikes, the suffocation tricks, balance tortures, breath restraints, noise punishments, the medieval world still hides layers of cruelty few people today have ever even imagined. These were not the famous tortures, they were the quiet experiments, the mind warps, the body fatigue traps used only by certain inquisitors, wardens, or rogue lords who wanted total control over the human spirit. Here are more extremely obscure, almost forgotten medieval punishments. 1. The rib tremor frame. Victims stood with their torso pressed gently against a wooden board fitted with tiny vibrating rods. Not enough to injure, but enough that every heartbeat sent shivers through the ribs. After hours, the trembling sensation crawled into the spine, creating a panic-like tightness. 2. The flicker-hour torch. A torch hung behind the prisoner with a flame that flickered from drafts. The shifting light cast unstable shadows across the walls. Staring at these trembling shapes for hours made victims hallucinate movements that weren't there. 3. The shoulder weight drift. A loose wooden collar carried a small, sliding weight that moved whenever the prisoner breathed. Some breaths were painless, others sent a jolt down the shoulder. The unpredictability destroyed focus and rested constantly on the mind. 4. The uneven silence shift. Prisoners were moved between a cell of total silence, a cell of soft, constant echoes. The switching happened at random. The brain could never adapt. Victims lost the ability to tell real sounds from imagined ones. 5. The nerve point stand. 3 tiny pressure pegs were placed under each foot, right where nerves are most sensitive. Standing still hurt, shifting hurt, lifting a foot hurt more. It was a static torture designed to exhaust every muscle without spilling blood. 6. The bent neck weight. A collar forced the victim to lower their head by a single unnatural angle. Not enough to snap or choke, just enough. You might think we've reached the end of medieval cruelty, but hidden archives, abandoned fortresses, and obscure monastic records reveal even more terrifying, extremely rare punishments that were almost lost to history. These weren't the flashy, bloody tortures, these were the silent destroyers, the ones designed to break a human being slowly, without spilling a drop. Here are more forgotten medieval punishments, even darker and more disturbing. 1. The spine-hold alcove. A prisoner was forced to stand with their back pressed into a carved stone groove shaped almost like a human spine, but not perfectly. Standing in it twisted their vertebrae by a few degrees. Minutes felt uncomfortable. Hours became burning agony. Days caused spasms that bent the body permanently. 2. The hollow hum needle. A thin metal needle was placed near the prisoner's ear, not touching, but close enough that air vibrations made it hum softly. The constant high-pitched resonance drilled into the mind. Even after release, victims reported hearing the phantom hum for months. 3. The tilted breathing post. Victims were chained upright to a pole angled slightly backward. This forced the chest into a stretched position, making breathing shallow and exhausting. After hours, every inhale felt like pushing air through a cracked pipe. Not deadly, just endless torture. 4. The sweat trickle test. A hot stone was placed several feet above the prisoner. It warmed the air just enough to make them sweat slowly. The slow trickle of sweat down the back felt like crawling insects, driving victims to madness because they couldn't wipe it away. 5. The crooked path walk. A narrow corridor forced prisoners to walk back and forth on an uneven zigzag floor. With every step, the ground slanted differently. Ankles twisted, calves burned, and the constant need to balance drained all strength. Hours felt like miles of torture. 6. The eyeshadow wall. The victim faced a wall lit by a flickering torch placed behind them. Even after every brutal, strange, and psychologically horrifying method we've explored, medieval cruelty still descends deeper, into punishments so rare and secretive that they were almost erased from history. These were the quiet tortures, the slow ones, the ones that didn't rely on blood or blades but on mind-breaking discomfort and subtle physical strain. One extremely obscure torment was the balance rod brace. The prisoner's arms were tied outward to a long rod balanced perfectly on a pivot. Any tiny movement, breathing, shifting, tensing, tipped the rod. The victim had to hold perfectly still while their own muscles trembled uncontrollably. Hours later, the arms felt like burning iron, yet stopping meant punishment. Another disturbing method was the hollow noise cylinder. A tall tube was placed over the prisoner's upper body. Every sound echoing inside, breathing, heartbeat, swallowing, became amplified and distorted. Victims felt trapped inside their own body noises, unable to escape the booming internal echoes. In remote hill fortresses, prisoners endured the unstable knee stand. Victims knelt on round, smooth stones coated with oil. Knees slipped constantly, forcing them to tense every muscle just to stay upright. They weren't allowed to fully fall, nor to stand. The legs spasmed from exhaustion long before the torment ended. Another strange punishment was the rustling veil. A thin, dry cloth hung loosely over the prisoner's face. Every breath made it rustle softly. Over time, the constant rustling noise created paranoia, like someone whispering inches away. Victims often begged to remove the veil long before pain even started. One chilling sensory torture was the heartbeat mirror. A small, polished metal plate was strapped to the chest. With every heartbeat, the reflection trembled slightly. Staring at this shaking image for hours made victims feel their heart was moving visibly outside their body, causing panic and dread. Even after exploring so many brutal, strange, and psychologically destructive medieval punishments, history still hides more, methods so rare that they appear only in marginal notes, forgotten legal codes, or whispered stories from abandoned fortresses. These were punishments not meant to kill but to wear down the mind, twist the senses, and break the body slowly. One rare torment was the breath counter hood. A cloth hood with tiny sewn beads hung lightly over the nose. Every breath caused the beads to shift softly. The constant tickling made victims hyper-aware of breathing, eventually causing panic, shallow inhalation, and overwhelming anxiety, pure psychological suffocation without harming the lungs. Another eerie torture was the swaying foot beam. Prisoners stood with one foot on a narrow wooden beam suspended by ropes. The beam swayed slightly with every heartbeat, forcing constant micro-adjustments. After hours, the calf burned, the ankle weakened, and balance became impossible, but falling triggered immediate punishment, so victims fought exhaustion to stay upright. Some remote castles used the dripping thread test. Instead of water, a single thread dangled above the prisoner. Every few seconds, it brushed lightly against the forehead or cheek. The contact was so gentle it felt imaginary. Eventually, victims couldn't tell whether the thread touched them or their mind invented it. Another strange method was the shifting weight belt, a leather strap with small sand-filled pouches that moved unpredictably as the prisoner walked or breathed. The subtle shifting created constant imbalance, exhausting muscles and causing dizziness without visible injury. A particularly cruel device was the narrow sight visor. A metal mask with thin slits limited peripheral vision. Prisoners could see only straight ahead, shadows and movements at the edges of sight caused constant fear and disorientation. Days spent in this narrowed world created paranoia and panic. Even after all the punishments described so far, medieval cruelty still has deeper, stranger, little-known methods, devices so rare that only a handful of chronicles mention them. These weren't always bloody or lethal, but they were designed to exhaust, confuse, disorient, weaken, and mentally break a person until they collapsed from fear itself. One such method was the leaning cage. This metal frame was built at a slight slant so the prisoner could neither stand straight nor sit. Every position strained the knees, hips, and back. Hours turned into trembling fatigue. Days turned into muscle spasms so severe victims couldn't walk afterward. Another obscure device was the weighted shutter room. Wooden shutters opened and closed slowly at random intervals, letting in bursts of cold wind or sudden silence. The unpredictability drained the victim's nerves, making rest impossible. Even blinking became stressful because they never knew when the next blast would come. Some dungeons used the swallowing chain, a collar fitted with a small weight that tugged the neck down. The more a prisoner swallowed, the tighter the chain pulled. It didn't choke, but it created a constant pressure that made eating, drinking, and even breathing uncomfortable. Another eerie torment was the shifting lantern cell. A lantern swung from a ceiling beam, casting moving shadows across walls. The prisoner, unable to lie down or turn away, watched the shadows twist endlessly. After hours, the mind imagined figures walking in the room, turning light into a psychological nightmare. In remote fortresses, victims endured the stone temperature room. The walls were alternately heated and cooled throughout the day. Sometimes the stones were warm, sometimes icy. The constant change kept the body in confusion, never able to adjust, creating headaches, nausea, and shivering exhaustion. One strange punishment was the narrow shoulder brace. This wooden clamp pressed inward on both shoulders. Even after all the horrors already explored, the medieval world still hides deeper, darker, almost surreal punishments, methods used so rarely, so quietly, and so brutally that they barely survived in fragments of manuscripts or whispers from old inquisitorial archives. One such method was the lung lantern cage. This was a narrow metal frame placed around the torso. It didn't crush, but it expanded outward slightly so the victim had to inhale deeper to fill the gap. Every breath stretched the ribs to painful limits. After hours, the body trembled from overbreathing, turning natural breathing into torment. Another sinister device was the ankle twist spindle. Victims stood with their feet locked into small wooden hollows. A spindle tied to leather cords twisted slowly, forcing the ankles inward or outward at unnatural angles. Bones didn't break immediately, tendons tore first, creating sharp, trembling spasms that radiated up through the legs and spine. In remote mountain fortresses, prisoners faced the hollow wind tunnel. A narrow passage captured mountain gusts and funneled them directly at the victim. The wind wasn't violent, it was constant, numbing skin, drying eyes, and making the prisoner shiver endlessly. Hours of exposure left the victim exhausted and delirious, unable to rest. Some dungeons used the drip echo chamber, a circular cellar where water dripped from a ceiling into a metal pan. Each drop echoed loudly, creating an unpredictable rhythm. Victims waited helplessly for the next sound. Seconds could feel like minutes or hours. Many broke down from anticipation alone. There was also the tilt bar restraint, a wooden pole tied vertically behind the back, with the victim's arms strapped upward to it. The wrists were tied high, just above head level. It didn't break bones, but it forced the shoulders into a burning stretch that worsened over time. Even breathing made the joints ache. One obscure punishment was the grain pit, a deep hole filled partly. Even after everything described so far, medieval cruelty still goes deeper, into punishments so rare, so hidden, and so unsettling that they barely survived in records. These weren't used often, not because they were too brutal, but because they were so specific and so mentally destructive that only certain lords, inquisitors, or warlords dared use them. One such sinister device was the pressure harness frame. This wooden frame clamped around the ribcage and hips, squeezing inward slowly. Victims felt their own organs shift painfully, like an invisible fist tightening around their lungs. Breathing became a desperate task, each inhale sharp and incomplete. Another nightmare was the tightening stool, where ropes bound the elbows and knees beneath a chair. As the ropes twisted, the limbs folded inward unnaturally. Bones didn't break, but joints screamed with pressure. There existed a psychological torment called the murmur chamber. This wasn't about blood, it was about madness. Prisoners were kept in rooms where tiny holes in the walls let in faint, distant whispers. Wind, echoes, and trickling water created the illusion of people talking just out of reach. After days of listening, victims couldn't distinguish real voices from imagined ones. In some border fortresses, punishment came as the stone thread walk. A long corridor covered in small sharp pebbles forced offenders to walk barefoot, carrying heavy buckets of water. Every step drove stones into the soles, cutting deeper each time. Stumbling meant the guards poured the water out and forced them to start again. Another obscure torture was the weighted drip. Victims sat bound while heavy drops of cold water fell rhythmically onto the same spot of their skull. The constant, unchanging impact became torture, not from pain, but from the maddening repetition that broke their sense of time. One of the rarest physical torments was the iron tongue brace. A metal rod forced the mouth open while a small hook pulled. Even after uncovering such an enormous list of medieval punishments, the darkness goes deeper, into obscure, rarely documented torments used only in hidden dungeons, private courts, or rogue militia camps. One such chilling method was the spine cradle incline. Victims were laid on a curved wooden plank that bent the back unnaturally upward. Ropes pulled the arms and legs downward, creating constant pressure on the spine. This didn't break bones immediately, it created slow burning, crippling agony that intensified by the hour until victims begged to be knocked unconscious. Another forgotten method was the sandweight press, where bags of sand were placed on the chest gradually. The slow increase of pressure made breathing tighter and tighter, causing victims to panic long before actual suffocation. There was also the narrow foot chain. Prisoners were forced to stand with their feet locked in iron rings spaced so close together that even shifting weight became agony. After hours, the calves cramped, knees locked, and blood circulation faltered. Some fainted standing up, only to be awakened by sudden jolts of pain. More tormenting still was the shadow stalk, used in pitch-black cells. Guards walked silently around prisoners without touching them. Victims heard soft footsteps, slow breathing, and faint tapping but never saw who, or what, was near. Days of this silent intimidation broke even the strongest minds. In more sadistic corners of medieval Europe, people endured the ice slab rest. Prisoners were forced to sit on thick blocks of ice, naked, while chains prevented them from standing or lifting themselves. The cold numbed the skin, then burned it, then caused deep tissue pain. Hypothermia crept in slowly but deliberately. In warmer climates, the opposite existed, the sun grip, where offenders stood with their arms tied upward under direct heat until they collapsed, dehydrated and delirious. Some punishments were almost surgical. The tendon twister used thin cords. Even after exploring so many frightening punishments, medieval history still hides more strange and disturbing methods, some so rarely used that they survived only in fragments of old manuscripts. These were not gory methods, but psychologically and physically tormenting in ways that stretched human endurance to its limit. One such forgotten cruelty was the posture rack. Instead of stretching limbs until they tore, this device forced the victim into unnatural sitting or crouching positions for hours or days. The frame held the body rigidly, making muscles spasm, blood flow weaken, and joints lock painfully. Many people collapsed the moment they were untied, unable to stand from sheer stiffness. Another unsettling punishment was the silence chamber. This wasn't a violent torture, but a psychological one. Prisoners were kept in rooms with thick walls that absorbed echoes, making even their own breathing feel distant. No sound existed, no footsteps, no voices, no wind. Days in this unnatural silence caused people to lose sense of time, direction, and even identity. In remote fortresses, guards used the suspended cradle, a wooden frame hung by ropes. The victim was placed inside in a stiff, uncomfortable pose while the cradle swayed unpredictably in a cold, drafty shaft. The constant motion prevented sleep and caused dizziness, nausea, and disorientation. There was no physical harm, yet the mental strain was overwhelming. Some punishments relied entirely on restraint. The limb rings were tight metal hoops fitted around wrists, ankles, or elbows, forcing the victim to stay in one fixed position. They couldn't stretch, turn, or lie comfortably, and after a few hours, numbness turned into deep pulsating pain. In certain courts, offenders faced the judgment bench, a narrow plank without back support. They were ordered to sit completely upright, hands placed on knees, without slouching or shifting. Guards watched for any movement. Even after exploring so many brutal punishments, medieval cruelty still goes deeper, into forgotten devices so disturbing that they feel almost unreal. One such horror was the lung compressor, a hinged wooden frame strapped tightly around the chest. Executioners tightened it slowly, preventing the ribs from expanding. Breathing became shallow, then sharp, then nearly impossible. Victims didn't die immediately, they stayed conscious for hours, gasping like drowning men on dry land. Another nightmare was the tendon plucker, a hooked iron rod used to pull tendons from the arms or legs through small incisions. Instead of killing quickly, it immobilized the victim in excruciating pain while leaving them fully aware. Medieval inquisitors also used the iron blossom, a small metal sphere that opened like a flower when twisted. Inserted into wounds, it widened the injury from the inside, tearing flesh with every turn. Meanwhile, underground prisons sometimes featured the starvation perch, a narrow pointed pole on which prisoners were forced to sit. Their own weight pressed into the point, causing unbearable pressure and internal injury. Hours felt like days as muscles spasmed and blood flow weakened. There were punishments designed not just to hurt but to shred hope itself. The endless circle walk forced victims to march around a pole with chains that tightened slightly every full rotation. After hours, every step bruised ribs, squeezed lungs, and made breathing a battle. Another torment was the stone drip, where cold water dripped onto the same spot on the victim's forehead for hours or days. It created panic, insomnia, and eventually hallucinations, driving many insane long before physical harm took hold. Some devices were horrifyingly simple. The nail cage enclosed victims in iron frames studded with long nails, not enough to stab deeply, but enough to pierce the skin whenever the victim shifted, breathed, or trembled from fear. Others endured the hot sand funnel. Even after exploring dozens of medieval punishments, the well of cruelty still hasn't run dry. The medieval mind engineered suffering with such disturbing creativity that more horrific methods continue to surface. One such torment was the ladder torture. Victims were tied to a tall wooden ladder laid flat on the ground, their limbs stretched painfully. The ladder was then lifted upright and dropped suddenly, never enough to kill, but enough to wrench joints, crack ribs, and leave the person dangling helplessly in twisted agony. Executioners often repeated this process, pausing only to taunt the victim or pour cold water over their face to keep them conscious. Another terrifying practice involved flaying wheels. Unlike the breaking wheel used for smashing bones, this version was designed for peeling skin. The victim's arms and legs were tied outward, and executioners used hooked knives to slice slowly, pulling skin away in strips while the wheel rotated. The slow spinning spread the pain evenly and ensured the crowd could see every moment of suffering. This was not just execution, it was a public performance of terror. Medieval dungeons also evolved into nightmarish underground chambers. Some castles had cave dungeons carved into natural rock formations. These spaces were damp, icy cold, and filled with dripping water that echoed endlessly. Prisoners were chained so close to the walls they could barely move, and the lack of light created sensory deprivation so intense that many lost their sanity long before their bodies gave out. In deeper caverns, bats and rats swarmed freely, nibbling on exposed wounds or stealing food from prisoners' mouths. Another gruesome torment was the iron clamp method. Heavy metal clamps were attached to sensitive body parts, fingers, calves, even the jaw, and tightened slowly. Each turn of the screw crushed cartilage, cracked bones, and tore muscle fibers. Some clamps had spiked teeth inside that dug deeper with every twist. The medieval world seemed to have an endless imagination for cruelty, producing punishments so twisted and brutal that they sound like nightmares invented by horror writers, yet they were chillingly real. One such torment was the iron stool, a deceptively simple metal seat heated until it glowed red. Victims were forced to sit on it, their flesh searing instantly. Executioners adjusted the heat to prolong agony, sometimes heating it slowly so pain crept upward from the skin to the muscles, nerves, and spine. Another horrifying act was skinning, reserved for treason or extreme betrayal. Victims were strapped tightly to prevent movement while the executioner peeled away strips of skin with terrifying precision. Some were skinned partially to keep them alive longer, creating a slow-burning pain that few could endure for long. Poles were also used in gruesome ways. The torture pole forced the victim to cling to a narrow wooden post for hours or days, held upright by ropes. Any slip caused broken ribs or internal injuries. In harsher regions, spikes were embedded into the poles so every shift pierced the flesh. Some criminals were tied to poles at crossroads, left as living signposts, exposed to weather, animals, and the mockery of travelers. Many died slowly, not by direct violence but by starvation, exhaustion, and sheer despair. Bone-crushing devices grew more elaborate too. The bone compressor used thick wooden clamps tightened around arms or legs until bones splintered beneath the skin. Executioners listened for the faint crack of joints snapping, then tightened again and again. Victims often fainted, only to be awakened and tortured further so the punishment lasted the full sentence. Some towns imposed sleep torture. Victims were forced to stand on slanted boards or tiny pegs that allowed no rest.